Welcome to the Israel Connection, coming to you live today from our JS studio in Melbourne. On today's program, I'll be moderating a live discussion on the topic IDF actions in Gaza directly contradict Jewish ethical tradition, based on an article and extensive supplementary documentation produced by Paul Komesaroff, Professor of Medicine at Monash University and Executive Director of the international NGO Global Reconciliation, and his colleague Jeremiah Kenner, a public servant employed by an Australian government agency. They will be participating alongside Rabbi Daniel Rabin, the Chief Rabbi from Caulfield Synagogue in Melbourne, and Brigadier General Reserves Amir Avivi, who was the founder and chair of the Israel Defence and Security Forum, otherwise known as Habithonistim, who will together be opposing the proposition that IDF actions in Gaza contradict Jewish ethical principles. Listeners to this program are invited to submit questions to the panel by sending text messages to 0404 556 988 or via WhatsApp to +61 404 556 988. I believe that this event presents a rare opportunity to have a meaningful conversation among members of our community who have been generally unwilling to talk directly to one another. In the Jewish spirit of constructive engagement, I'm trying today to conduct a dialogue that will uphold Jewish values and Jewish identity in difficult times. In a moment, Paul Komesaroff and Jeremiah Kenner will kick off by talking for 10 minutes about what they have written contending that IDF actions in Gaza directly contradict Jewish ethical tradition. And thereafter, I will invite Rabbi Rabin and Amir Avivi to respond for 10 minutes. At that point, I will allow Paul Komesaroff and Jeremiah Kenner to comment directly on what Rabbi Rabin and Amir Avivi have said and to pose questions to them for 5 minutes. And subsequently, I will invite Rabbi Rabin and Amir Avivi to comment conversely for 5 minutes. For the last half hour, I will put questions on my own to our panel, questions that I have pre-prepared and questions that may have come in from our audience that may be worthwhile discussing. And remember that number, 0404 556 988. And I now hand the baton to you, Paul Komesaroff.
Thank you. I think Jeremy is going to go first.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Jeremy's going first.
Thank you, David, and thank you all those online for joining us today. I'd like to start with a contextual comment or request, really. We're 5 Jewish men sitting together online. We have not just 2 perspectives on what we're about to discuss, but most likely at least 5 different perspectives. And to paraphrase the joke, probably 6 or more. Whatever our attitudes towards the claims and experiences of the Palestinian people, all 5 of us care about Israel, and all 5 of us care about human life. That is the ground from which we are speaking to one another. For this to be a useful exchange of ideas, I suggest that we exercise a certain level of restraint. I'd like us to commit to avoiding what philosophers call ad hominem attacks. No name calling, no use of pejoratives, no use of terms like anti-Semite, self-hating Jew, fanatic, or apologist. I'd also like us to make an effort not to make this interaction a debate about whether or not what we are not just observing but living through is genocide, or whether we are Zionists or anti-Zionists, or neither. I especially implore us to not get into the weeds of whether criticism of Israeli policy can be characterized automatically as anti-Semitism. These conversations are saturating the airwaves, and are outside the scope of the question that Paul and I have raised. I ask that we agree to this. The essence of what Paul and I have tried to do is to explore and then challenge the premise that what the Israeli government and the IDF are doing in Gaza is A, defensible from the perspective of core sources of Jewish tradition and ethics, and B, consistent with the broad framework of Jewish ethics as exemplified by the Bible, the Talmud, and the full range of rabbinic commentary through the ages. We say that the answer to the first question, is it defensible, depends on what sources one is drawing from, and whether one is representing the full spectrum of teachings or cherry-picking from amongst them. And that the answer to the second question, is it consistent, is a clear no. Paul?
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and thank you, David, for inviting us to participate in this important discussion. The Israeli response to the Hamas attacks on October the 7th, 2023, has been massive. It's caused multiple relocations of large proportions of the population of Gaza, the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, including many women and children, and mass starvation. There's a great deal of evidence that the actions carried out on behalf of and on the instructions of the Israeli government have included the killing of children and innocent men and women, attacks on hospitals and health workers, destruction of places of learning and worship, mass starvation, and other atrocities. The Israeli response has attracted widespread international condemnation, even from parties generally supportive of the Israeli government, and has raised questions about its underlying moral justification. Within Israel, it has produced confusion, dismay, and division. Supporters of the right-wing Netanyahu government have argued that these actions are in conformity with ancient ethical and legal principles of Judaism. Netanyahu himself, in a famous speech on October the 28th, 2023, invoked a passage from Deuteronomy to justify ruthless, aggressive action against perceived adversaries. Many similar claims have been made that passages in the Bible support or justify the actions of the IDF in Gaza. This raises an important question. If the IDF is in fact carrying out the acts described, would this be consistent with the philosophy and ethics of Judaism? To address this question, we have carried out a detailed analysis of key arguments, claims, and imperatives in the corpus of Jewish ethical thinking, encompassing the Bible and the ensuing rabbinic commentaries, including in particular the Babylonian Talmud. The Bible does, at least at first sight, contain a few passages that provide apparent support for at least some of the acts referred to. These include claims by the Jewish people to the land of Israel, promotion of acts to drive out enemies, and justification for acts of revenge and retribution. However, fundamentalist readings of these passages are in almost all cases repudiated by the subsequent Talmudic and other rabbinic commentaries, which interpret them in relation to context and underlying values. These later texts set out foundational ethical principles which establish the framework for the conduct of individual Jews and Jewish communities globally. Although there's been some evolution over time, these foundational principles have remained stable for nearly 2,000 years. Foremost among the principles is respect for the sanctity of life, which is prioritized above almost all other commandments. Another is the requirement to pursue peace and reconciliation, which expresses itself as a core Talmudic obligation to seek ways to resolve conflicts with minimal harm to all parties involved and to avoid violence. A principle of responsibility and compassion for others is repeatedly emphasized, with a specific requirement to care for and support those who are particularly vulnerable, especially children. Multiple passages stress the need to avoid indirect harm to innocent people and to prevent collateral damage when conflict arises. These principles are applied in many discussions in the Talmud of direct relevance to the events in Gaza, offering clear guidance regarding contemporary challenges. Here are a few key examples. Civilian protection is a moral imperative, as is proportionality of response. The use of human shields is forbidden to anyone, and if they are used, the shields cannot be attacked. This argument is a little complicated because there's evidence that both sides have used human shields in this conflict. But whatever's the case, Talmudic ethics stresses a moral imperative to protect innocent people, requiring that strict steps be taken to limit harm to such people and imposing punishment on those who fail to do so. Collective punishment is absolutely prohibited, unequivocally and unconditionally. This includes causing mass starvation or allowing it to continue to exist. The right to self-defense is recognised and supported, subject to elaborate but clear conditions explicitly intended to prevent this right from being used as a device to engage in aggression, including in the context of the existence of an immediate and direct threat and the absence of alternative means to neutralise the danger. Even when self-defense is justified, the responsibility to minimise harm remains absolute. Aggression disguised as self-defense is a serious ethical and legal violation. Our analyses of the Talmud and later texts have identified multiple insights relevant to the conduct of war in Gaza and elsewhere. Our conclusions are clear and inescapable. 1. The obstruction of deliveries of food, humanitarian aid, medical care, and safe evacuation of civilians blatantly contravenes the obligation to prioritise life. 2. The targeting of civilians, and in particular, the large-scale murder of children, is directly contrary to the most elementary principles of Jewish ethics. 3. Attacks on civilians and the widespread devastation of homes, hospitals, schools, public spaces, and agricultural land cannot be justified by the right to self-defense. 4. Such actions cannot be justified by claims about the use of human shields. And 5. Collective punishment and mass starvation are unequivocally prohibited by Jewish law and ethics. In other words, Israeli government policy and the conduct of the IDF diverge in fundamental ways from the core ethical precepts of Judaism. Neither its actions nor the arguments it advances to justify them can be regarded as consistent with the deep and enduring body of knowledge and wisdom that is constitutive of Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So can we now go to Amir, Brigadier General Reserves Amir Avivi, to start responding to the comments that have just been made?
Yes, so I think the state of Israel and the army of Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, are the most moral army in the world. And we always fight, not just according to our Jewish codes, but also according to international law. Israel has been fighting more than a year and a half in an existential war on 7 different fronts against Hezbollah, militias in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, Iran, Gaza. A war that started with a terrible massacre of 1,200 Israelis that were massacred by Hamas, raped, burned alive. Heads were decapitated. People were taken hostages. And we are dealing with a vicious terror organization the size of ISIS. It took a whole global coalition years to deal with ISIS. Hamas is bigger than ISIS, more organized, more equipped. And this is a huge, huge challenge to really deal with such an organization. Now, what's happening in Gaza is very clear. Hamas is using all the civilian infrastructure. The headquarters of Hamas are inside hospitals. They are inside schools. They're using their own civilians as human shields. Now, international law, not just Judaism, is very, very clear. Any place which becomes a military place is a military site that can be targeted. This is international law. It's not even about Judaism. And the army never, ever attacks a place that is not military. It's always attacking a terror infrastructure, and this is what the IDF is doing. Now, in order to safeguard the Gazan population, in every single area the IDF operates, it gives an announcement before to the population, listen, we're going to operate in this place. Now, I hope we understand that when you as an army announce to your enemies where you are going to operate, this endangers our soldiers. And yet, we do that. We announce, we say, listen, we are going to operate in this area. You need to evacuate it for your own safety. So this movement of Gazans from place to place is to safeguard them. We don't want to fight in an area that is full of civilians. We want to fight the terrorists. Now, we have to remember that in any normal war, everywhere in the world, usually what happens that when a massive war starts, the population usually leaves the country, just as we saw in Ukraine. 7-8 million Ukrainians fled Ukraine. They didn't want to be caught in a war. Nobody blocked their borders. Nobody said to the Ukrainians, you cannot get out of Ukraine. But this is what's happening with the Gazans. The Egyptians are blocking the Egyptian border completely against international law, not enabling them to move outside of Gaza. So we are in a reality where the world is not doing anything and not really making sure that the Gazans can be, at least for a while, in a safety zone outside of the war. So they're inside Gaza, they're locked inside Gaza. And then when the army has to operate and destroy Hamas infrastructure in order to defend Israel, Israel finds itself needing to move the Gazans from place to place in order to keep them out of the war zone as it's happening. It's very, very complicated, but it's the only way to really safeguard the Gazans from the war. Israel, throughout the war, has brought in massive, massive amounts of humanitarian aid. Anybody that claims that Israel intentionally does mass starvation or something like that, it's a lie. It's a simple lie. It's not happening. There is no starvation in Gaza. There is massive amounts of humanitarian aid going into Gaza all the time. And unfortunately, Hamas is still ruling its own society. So when this aid goes in, Hamas seizes it, takes it for itself, distribute it however it wants. They use, by the way, the food to threaten the Gazans and say to them, look, if you don't join Hamas, we won't give you food. So they force people to fight, even 16-year-old kids, in order to get food and in order for the families to get food. So Israel tried to create a different mechanism, bringing these American companies that make sure that the food goes straight to the Gazans and not to Hamas hands. It's working well, but still partially. A lot of the humanitarian aid does go to Hamas hand, unfortunately. And in order to really operate in a way that minimizes the collateral damage, Israel created a humanitarian zone along the shore in an area called El Mawasi and the central camps. And in this humanitarian zone, Israel sends all the food, the water, electricity, everything that's needed. And Israel is not operating or maneuvering in this humanitarian zone. Throughout the war, there are areas that intentionally Israel doesn't go to in order to keep them as humanitarian zones, and Israel fights in areas that are not humanitarian zones. Now, we are in a full-scale war. And if you look at international law says the fighting needs to be proportional. Proportional to what? Proportional to the extent of the war. For example, when the US nuked Japanese cities, they thought it was proportional looking at the extent of the Second World War and how big it was, or when Britain leveled down all cities in Berlin and Dresden and so on, they looked at it as something proportional to the extent of the war. Now, Israel is not doing anything even similar to what the West has done, whether it's Europe or the US, but we have to understand this is a very big existential war, and Israel is fighting in a proportional way. Even if I take Hamas numbers, which are completely false, but I'll stick to them for a moment. Even according to Hamas numbers, the ratio between the amount of terrorists killed and the amount of civilian killed is 1-to-1. Now, throughout history, international law put numbers of what is the normal ratio, especially talking about fighting in very dense urban areas. Usually, the ratio varies between 1-to-5 or 1-to-10, meaning for every soldier or terrorist killed, 5 or 10 civilians. This is a normal ratio for a big war. In Israel, it's not even 1-to-1. It means that really the IDF is doing everything possible to really target the terrorists and not target civilians. Every single target is really analyzed. It's always according to very accurate intelligence. It always includes basically checking that, there is a minimum civilians or no civilians in the area. There is endless amount of events where the army, although they are seeing terrorists, they don't shoot in order not to endanger children or the Gazan society. But still, it's a war. Now, we cannot have a reality of double standards. Nobody can demand from Israel to fight in a different way that any other country would fight, or do things differently from any other country that is trying to really defend itself. And unfortunately, what I see here is double standards. It's
Amir,
really
let's stop there. I think you've had your allocation, and Rabbi Daniel, I'll let you respond in the second round when I've given the opportunity to Paul and Jeremy to now take a 5-minute time slot to come back into the fray. So either Jeremy or Paul, do you want to now come back and respond?
David, if I could, we will give up a couple of those 5 minutes to give Daniel an opportunity to weigh in on the halachic component of this.
Yes, that's a good
so
idea.
We have a fuller spectrum of things to respond to.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's not often people want rabbis to talk, but it's greatly appreciated, and obviously thank you to David for organizing. And I want to just correct something that you said, David, that we're reluctant to talk to each other, and you brought us together. I've got no reluctance to ever talk to Paul or Jeremy, so it's not like we haven't wanted to talk. I think we just haven't had the opportunity. So I want sort of to correct that record. And I like what you said in the beginning, Jeremy. Of course, there's a myriad of opinions, and a lot of, I think just to begin by sort of acknowledging the challenges that, the people in Israel are facing, the people in Gaza are facing. I think all of us, and certainly I can only talk for myself really, but, when I was in Israel, I've been fortunate to be there a number of times since October 7th, and to see the ongoing challenges, pain, trauma that they've been facing. The deaths of our boys and girls who serve in the IDF, the families are still reeling, and of course, all the tragedy of those who've lost their lives in Gaza, all the innocent civilians. I think we've just got to acknowledge that pain and acknowledge that reality. But I think we have to be very, very careful. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's out there today. And I respect having Amir here because honestly, and again, I don't talk for myself, and I don't know, Paul and Jeremy, your military knowledge, but mine is certainly nowhere near the knowledge of Amir and the reality on the ground. I don't know necessarily what's happening on the ground. I've had the privilege of meeting Amir in Israel and hearing from him a number of times, and his access to information, his knowledge of serving in the IDF, and of course at the rank he was, and even today what he does. A lot of the things that he said, I I'm going to take it on face value that he knows what he's talking about. But that being said, I think we have to be careful when we throw out accusations that the IDF are not following halakha or have contravened halakha or not following Jewish law. And whether there may be certain principles that have to be further investigated or using, and we can get into specifics shortly. Why I say we have to be careful is because if the Jewish people today are facing a massive rise in anti-Semitism, and I don't care which side of politics you sit on or what your view of Israel is, it's a lived reality. I mean, I speak to congregants all the time. There's a lot of fear out there, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be truthful, and we're not saying we shouldn't hold our leaders to account if they make mistakes. We certainly have to do that. But throwing out these statements, even if we sort of give a document which touches on a little bit of halakha and then makes certain remarks as taking it for fact that, Israel is starving, people in Gaza, as you just heard from Amir, that's not necessarily true. And I don't believe it's true. And, there's so much context around that we have to be very careful to just throw out that accusation. Also, in terms of, the IDF itself, I know that Rav Goren, who was, the founding rabbis of the IDF, said, the concept of Toah HaNeshek, the purity of arms, meaning the IDF's basis is really founded on the principles of morality, of trying to do their best to look after the civilian populations that they may have to engage with. Does that mean that they always get it right? Does that mean that there's no rotten apples? Of course, in any army, in any society, there may be mistakes made. But to sort of accuse the IDF and saying, their agenda is to go out and murder children is a very, very dangerous accusation to throw at an army that, as I said, is based on these principles. Now, anecdotally, and again, I stress it being anecdotally, that, when I met in Israel, young men and women who are serving on the, in the IDF, and I met hundreds of them. One story in particular, which I think is very important. Yes, you can say, well, that's just the boots on the ground, their leadership's telling them to do other things. Well, the anecdotal information that I got is, number one, none of them want to be in the army right now. They all want to be at home enjoying their lives the same way we are. They don't want the people of Gaza to be suffering the same way we don't want. One soldier, I asked him, he'd been based in Gaza for a number of months, and I said, look, how are you holding up? How's it going over there? Firstly, he told me unequivocally that his superiors tell them to do everything within their power to avoid any civilian casualty. So this is not on the record. It wasn't for an interview. It wasn't, trying to defend the reputation of the IDF or, pressure that this was just talking one person to another. Here I'm visiting from Australia. What's it like? Tell me. And then I asked him, how do you stay motivated? And I think what he said was a very important part of this discussion. He said, and we were standing on the border of Gaza. He said, when I look ahead and I see Gaza, he said, there's no part of my being that hates what I'm seeing in front of me. And I'm not fighting because I hate what's in front of me. I'm fighting because I love what's behind me. My people, what they've gone through and the risk that they face, that's my motivation. And I thought that was very important because it does sort of depict when people think of the IDF, they sometimes, divorce it from the reality of who is actually in that army. They're conscripts, people who have to go and fight, who have to protect their land. And as I said, it doesn't mean that every action, is beyond reproach, that they always get everything right. Not necessarily true. And at times we know and we see it that there is a system. If soldiers do the wrong thing.
If I may, David, I think that takes the full component of our response time. So
okay, I'll donate some time. I'll donate some time back to you.
We could engage
that's
in a bit of
a fair interruption. So, Jeremy, take the baton.
Sure. Daniel, I was hoping that you would address the more halachic elements, as you indicated that you would. I think one of the problems we have, of course, is consistent with the contemporary political dialogue all over the Western world, is we have a debate about what facts are correct. And we're not going to resolve that on the radio today. We each have a different view of what are credible facts and what are not credible facts. For every 100 people you talk to who give you that information, there are 100 people giving different information to different reporters. And we aren't going to resolve that. We are operating from a different set of facts. And so what I hear you all saying is that the arguments that we're making are essentially irrelevant because the facts that we are relying upon as the basis of our arguments are invalid. And so we really have nowhere to go from there, which is why Paul suggested that we consider it as not as a hypothetical exactly, but if we start with the presumption that at least some of what the facts upon which we are relying, which are not just information thrown out without care for its consequences, but what we believe are based on authoritative reporting from within Israel as well as without, would that be consistent with the ethical tradition of Judaism as grounded in most of that history, which is the Talmudic tradition rather than the biblical tradition? So I don't know where we go with this. I guess I'll just, if we're going to return to the sort of factual element of this, I'd ask this, I guess, of Amir. Obviously, there's disagreement even amongst current and former military people about exactly what the character of the IDF's behavior is. Many of those of us, and I include myself in this, who have historically made the argument that the Israeli army is a grade above the behavior of armies anywhere else in the world. Are you saying that you see no difference between the behavior of the IDF in the current conflict and its behavior historically?
Definitely, I think this conflict is different because it's a different area and different challenges. But look, I'm in close contact with the leadership of the IDF, including with the chief of staff, which I met several times. And I don't know any officer in the army, especially not in the top echelon, that thinks they're doing things that are not according to international law or not according to Jewish values. I think that when you look at the way the Israeli society feel, they feel exactly the opposite. They say, how can we be the only nation on this globe that feeds its enemies? It's unprecedented.
But you do know that within Israel itself, there is significant concern about the behavior of the IDF. To what do you attribute those concerns? Misinformation?
So I think that unfortunately we see a certain group a bit in the media and also some retired generals that they're attacking, but the motivation is not really coming from a place that says we're doing wrong things. It's coming from a political stance. I think that as we are fighting an existential war, unfortunately, there are people who are really more bothered with politics and bringing down the government and their relationship with Netanyahu, and not really what's going on the ground. The vast majority of the Israeli society opposes these views. They see them as radical and unjust, and they think that the contrary. They think that we are risking our soldiers' lives. We are prolonging the war because we are feeding our enemies. But at the end of the day, Israel chose to do it. We chose to bring humanitarian aid into Gaza throughout the war. We know that we are paying a price with the lives of our soldiers. We know this is enabling Hamas to continue and fight because we are feeding them. It has a big price. It has a big discussion in Israel about that. I mean, according to international law, putting a siege is something that definitely can be done in wars. And because Israel is judged differently from many other countries, Israel is not really able to do what any other army in the world has done throughout history, is to put a siege until the enemy surrenders, and not starving people to death, but saying, okay, listen, surrender, we'll give you them as much food as you want, lay down your weapons, and it will be over.
Yeah. David,
So,
could I make a few comments?
Can I just put a point in myself before I'll let you talk, Paul? Amir just brought up the point of a siege. Now, we haven't really discussed much in the way of halakha, but this is a good illustration, I think, of the halakha of siege, which became relevant in the 1982 IDF siege of Beirut. The halakha is that when besieging a city, one side must be left unguarded so that anyone wishing to flee the city may do so. Now, Rabbi Shaul Israeli basically marginalized this halakha since it was out of sync with the contemporary practice of war. And Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who's been mentioned already, on the other hand, ruled that it should be applied since it reflected the higher moral standard of Jewish law of war. Interestingly, Michael Walzer, the famous Jewish philosopher and expert on the laws of war, wrote that this seems hopelessly naive. How is it possible to surround a city on 3 sides only? Such a statement, it may be claimed, could only be made in the legal literature of a people who possessed neither a state nor an army of its own. So we're talking here a lot about hypotheticals, and I think we need to be very practical in our conversation. And referring to halakha is obviously the key point of our discussion, and I think we should try and stick to determining whether the question of halakha that you've put in your article, Paul and Jeremy, whether they actually have weight in our discussion.
Paul.
Thank you. Could I make a few comments? Yeah, thanks for that comment, David. I'll just make a few quick comments in response to what Amir said. And I'll emphasize that the point of view that Jeremy and I are putting here is not an isolated one. We're not alone here. And in fact, last night, it was reported on the news that former Mossad, Shin Bet and IDF heads have called for an immediate end to the Gaza war, warning that it serves now messianist and extremist goals and is actually doing harm to Israel, leading to the loss of Israel's security. So we're not putting an isolated point of view. We're putting a point of view that's shared by very important and eminent people in Israel itself. Second point I'd make just quickly about international law. I'm not an expert on international law and wouldn't like to get into a discussion about it. But I do know enough that there can be arguments on both sides, both in relation to the law and other things. Israel is an occupying power, has all sorts of obligations, and we know that there are international rulings about the West Bank and so on that Israel appears not to be following. So there are arguments on both sides, but as I say, that's not within my expertise. The third point would be the one that Jeremy was talking about, and that's about the facts. There are different views about and different claims about what's factually true here, and I don't think we can get into an argument about it here. I think we'll leave it to the listeners to decide for themselves whether there is actually starvation in Gaza. I wouldn't want to try and claim that I have more evidence than anyone else, but I have to say my own personal view is that there is overwhelming evidence that there's starvation in Gaza, and to be able to claim to the contrary seems very, very strange. But let's leave it to our listeners here, who no doubt watch television and search the internet and so on, to make up their own minds about what the facts are. As Jeremy said, what we want to do is to discuss whether, if indeed these claims are true, if indeed there's starvation, if indeed children are being killed, if indeed hospitals have been bombed, and so on, whether that is consistent with Jewish ethics and the traditions of Jewish culture. That's the question that we've raised in our article. And so just in relation to that, and I'll finish with this point because this is getting right back to the heart of the matter. There's a discussion that Amir has really initiated about proportionality. I think that's a really big thing. It's a big thing in the Talmud. It's a big thing in our entire tradition here. And I think it's generally agreed, and this is not just in the Jewish tradition, it's agreed in the legal traditions, which I should say ultimately go back to the Talmudic tradition. It's agreed that there does need to be proportionality in the response. So there was an attack on October the 7th, we know that. Israel did respond, and the question is whether the killing of tens of thousands, maybe 60, 80, we don't know how many thousand people have died, compared to the 1,200 people who were brutally murdered on October the 7th, whether that is a proportional response. So that's one of the questions amongst many that we can that we can discuss. And I'll just finish with one last final comment, and that is that today is the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And there's been a very long discussion about whether, in fact, that was a proportional response, whether to drop a bomb on two cities, killing many hundreds of thousands of people, was in fact ethically justified. And I would think that many of the people listening to the radio program today would feel nervous about arguing that, in fact, it was justified for massive deaths of civilians in the way that occurred on those days. And I think we should just recognise that this is a day when we should pay homage to and respect the innocent civilians who died on this day 80 years ago.
Just before I hand over to you, perhaps Rabbi Rabin, to respond to that, the phone number is 0404 556988. I just would want to say, Paul, you said you're not an expert in international law. I think the question of proportionality is an issue in international law. So I don't think it's a point that really is one that should be pursued in our current discussion.
On the contrary, though, David, it suffuses the Talmud as well. So it's not just a principle of international law.
Yeah.
It's just
well,
let's go to the...
So I first want to just address a thing that, Jeremy, you've said, and that is, obviously, let's stick to halakha, and the facts can be debated. But the reality is you guys have written a paper, using halakhic principles and terms based on facts that you have taken as fact. It's not a theoretical paper or a hypothetical paper. It's a paper which has given a definition or a conclusion that the IDF are not following or not keeping to halakha. So that's why I started. I'm happy to go through every point in your article to sort of talk about, but if you talk about proportionality, so halakha, there's many different principles in halakha, and I think you guys did highlight a lot of those principles, which are correct in terms of their principles, like rodef and justified war and so on and so forth. But why it's important to suggest that if we want to talk about halakhic principles, that's fine. We can talk about the halakhic principles, and Paul, you would like the readers to sort of, or the listeners, I should say, to make their own decisions. I'm suggesting that the two of you have already made a decision based on evidence or facts, which I don't know, where you've based them on, but just hearing from Amir, who's, on the ground, so to speak, is challenge some of those facts. So the halakha, it's crucial that, the halakhic decisions have to be based on the halakha. Yeah, we can have a halakhic theoretical discussion, and we can talk about, proportionality. What does halakha say about proportionality? And I think, halakha, its strongest principle is that we do act morally in a war, but it doesn't, just like international law, proportionality is not about, necessarily mirroring losses. It's about the necessity to protect life. Now, you're saying the IDF are not going to the extent to protect life, and therefore not, keeping proportionality because there's 30,000 or 40,000 people dead. Now, Amir challenged that premise to say, hey, you have to look at the ratio of civilians to combatants, whether those numbers in fact are correct. And so, yes, halakha does, demand proportionality, but the proportionality is that we've got to ensure that we're doing our utmost to protect life. So if our response is they hurt us, so we're just going to carte blanche bomb the place and destroy it without, taking into account who we're trying to get, who we're trying to kill. Is it those who are being a rodef trying to kill us? So your points in your article are valid in the sense that you have raised, obviously, important halakhic issues which respond to, how does halakha and how does Torah view combat and war? But as I said, you're basing it on facts that you've taken as fact, and that's fine. I mean, if you believe those facts are true, then some of the principles you've applied are correct. But again, it's on the premise that what you've suggested is how the IDF are behaving and is what the government is doing.
So, Daniel,
those are your arguments, Daniel, of course.
Yeah.
And both of us are operating from a set of facts that we believe to be true based on extensive authority on both sides. It would be disingenuous to suggest that there isn't substantial factual claims made by a whole bunch of different people from different perspectives. To say that you have the correct facts and ours are just kind of arbitrarily decided or wishful thinking is no different than our making the same claim about yours.
100%.
Could I put it the other way around as a question to Daniel and Amir? If it were true that 20,000 children in Gaza have been killed, would you accept that that is consistent with Jewish law or ethics? That's essentially the question. And of course, there are many people who have claimed, Rabbi Yonan Zorev last night claimed that every child in Gaza should starve. And in our article, we quoted a passage.
Which rabbi said that?
Rabbi Shorov. I can send you.
I don't know who that is.
Yonan on Israeli television last night, and in our article we quoted a passage.
Paul, listen.
Sorry, I'll just finish. Just let me finish.
Okay?
Just let me finish the point.
In our article, it's not about what somebody said. There is no goal of war that the government says we need to starve people. There is a goal that says eradicating Hamas as a governmental and military entity, bringing back all our hostages, and creating the terms that never again there will be a terror army in Gaza. Is taking these goals and acting upon them. And of course, none of these goals talk about starving or something.
No, I agree with that. No,
Paul, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so my
but it's a
question
hypothetical. So
exactly.
It's not proven. So why put that hypothetical that needs to be necessarily responded to?
So it's called a counterfactual formula. Sorry,
Paul,
Jeremy,
I want to remind you that all the world showed photo of 2 children in Gaza claiming they are starving, and both photos were turned out to be false. One is a child that Israel itself took out of Gaza and sent to Italy for treatment. They put his photo all over the world. Now he's treated not for starvation, he's treated for illness.
My question is really a simple one. Let's put aside the differences in the interpretation of the facts. If it is in fact true, as many people have claimed, even Donald Trump, even Anthony Albanese and so on, even many eminent people in Israel, if it is true that tens of thousands of children have been killed in Gaza, is that something that you would consider is consistent with Jewish ethics?
You want to go, Amir? I can take it.
First of all, it's not true. But really the issue, this is not the way, at least professionally, that you measure things. In the war, you take every single attack, specific attack, and analyze it specifically. Was it done according to international law or not? Then it accumulates. And every attack the IDF does, you have a lawyer sitting with the forces that are conducting the attack. There is a very strict way of approving an attack on a target. Multiple times they don't attack because of these reasons, and then it accumulates. You cannot look at a general number. Now, the fact that Hamas is doing a propaganda, lying, sending, the only source the world is using is Hamas. This is Hamas throwing numbers. Hollywood at its best. Why take numbers of Hamas and treat them seriously? Because there is no other numbers. It's only Hamas. It's our enemy, our sworn enemy that is giving numbers, and everybody said that.
So the entire Israeli media are
I think that
Amir?
Sorry?
Any reporting within the Israeli media that conflicts with your claims is incorrect? They are just being duped by Hamas. Is that your position?
Look, at the end of the day, the reality in Israel is, and by the way, talking about generals, I lead an organization of 50,000 Israeli generals and commanders and operators, and none of them think that we are doing things that are not according to our Jewish values or international law. The generals you are talking about are 80, 90-year-old generals, really old elite, that really, unfortunately, instead of dealing with Jewish values and Zionism and the security, are dealing with politics.
Can I ask Rabbi Daniel if he would answer the question? If there is mass starvation in Gaza under the watch of the Israelis, is the acceptance or countenancing of that mass starvation consistent with Jewish law and ethics?
Okay, so that's obviously a very emotional question and a difficult question, because, again, of course, if somebody was intentionally trying to kill a child, if there was an order that I saw that the IDF had given its soldiers, go and kill, kids in Gaza, of course that's not consistent with halakha. Of course that's against our morals, values, and I think if anybody sort of condone that. I mean, just on the point of, because a lot of people say something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I mean, a lot of people saying, look at all the people who marched on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, it must be correct. I mean, I don't have to explain to any of you, just think it back to the Holocaust. Just because a lot of people think a particular way or driving a particular stance means it's correct. But anyway, no, it's not according to halakha. But halakha does recognize, obviously, the outcomes and the tragic outcomes of warfare, and how that is occurring. So again, if it's intentional, if they haven't gone about it in a way which has tried to avoid civilian casualties, if they're just being reckless, and let's say there's one terrorist and 300 kids playing, and they say, well, I'm going to drop a bomb on one terrorist and kill 300 kids. No, that's not consistent with halakha. But if someone's firing rockets at Israel and it happens to be coming from a school and they've done everything they can to try and avoid casualties, then yeah, it becomes complex and it's not so simple, and it'd have to be investigated. And halakha would have to look at the moral and halachic responsibility of who's doing what. And
if a rocket comes from a school, and then is it justified ethically to kill 300 children to silence?
You tell me. Do you think it's justified?
No, I think it's not justified. No, I think it's inconsistent with Talmudic law. But I'm interested. I'm interested to know your view.
If this rocket is going to kill the Israelis, if the rocket is going,
if this rocket was coming to your children's school, heading towards you, would it be okay to shoot it down?
300 children. I don't know.
Paul, if there was 300 children that this rocket was going to, 300 children in a Jewish school, would you be justified in trying to stop it if the only way would be to, destroy it before it leaves? Would there be a justification at all in your mind?
I think the Talmud is very clear. Not just the Talmud, I'm talking about the entire tradition. And one of my favorite philosophers is Maimonides, who addresses this question in detail. Yes. And the answer is that the preservation of life above all else is our underlying fundamental principle. One can't kill another person, even to save one's own life.
We prioritize Israeli civilian lives first and foremost. This is our responsibility, according to the Bible, by the way. We are responsible, first of all, to defend ourselves, our civilians. Then we are responsible to safeguard our soldiers. We are a people army. We have a responsibility towards the Jewish mothers and fathers to make sure that we safeguard our soldiers when they fight. And then we prioritize the enemy's civilians. This is the moral thing to do. You first prioritize your own civilians, your own people, and then you make sure you minimize collateral damage really as much as possible. And this is exactly what
I disagree.
Israel is doing.
Amir, I disagree with that proposition. I think the Noahide laws are universal. I don't think that there's any priority of one group of people over another. I don't think we can say that.
What do you mean?
White people are more important or valuable than black?
To defend, you say that America is not supposed to prioritize defending Americans above any other people when they go to war? I don't understand what you're saying. What are you saying here? A country has no responsibility to defend its own people as a top priority? What kind of world are we living?
I need to say something here. In terms of comments you made at the beginning, Jeremy, you've pointed out that your paper, your articles that you've documented are not exhaustive. And the trouble is that you have left out something from your discussion that perhaps might have been pertinent, and it is pertinent to what we're discussing now, because we're now coming up to the concept that was introduced called Milchemet Mitzvah, and this is a concept that has been expounded by Rabbi Shaul Israeli, who I've already mentioned in our conversation, one of Israel's most prominent rabbinic leaders. And this is basically what's called an obligatory war. And this is the war that Israel is in, I think Amir Avivi is maintaining.
Maybe I could just answer in one sentence and then ask Jeremy to comment.
Hey, David, we've got 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
Right?
Can I just say it's obvious we're not going to convince each other here. I think this has been a useful and respectful discussion. It's clear that there are differences of opinion, but the differences of opinion are throughout the entire Jewish world. Jeremy.
Oh, I think, David, it's your show. I think you've got 2 minutes left.
Well, have you got anything else to say? You've got about 30 seconds to make a comment. Anybody that has anything that they really want to get out?
I'd like to just say, and I think this is the beauty of who we are as a people. The fact that we're even having this discussion, is highlights that we deeply care. It's not just things just go past. And even if I may have differences of opinion to Paul and Jeremy in terms of what I think is happening, is whether it's right or wrong, the reality is the fact that we are deeply concerned is a testament to we as a people. Life is paramount, and it's not just Jewish life; it's any life. And so, yes, whilst the IDF may have a responsibility to its citizens and its people, and we all want every civilian to not be harmed. I think we should all just be proud that the Jewish people are continuing to ask these questions, and we're not just accepting that the status quo is fine. And I want to thank all those who are putting their lives in harm's way. The IDF soldiers who, many of them, as I said, don't want to be there and are risking their lives, and many of them are sacrificing their lives to save, civilians. Kol hakavod to them.
Well, I thank you all. We're really out of time, and let the discussion go on in various other ways that are possible. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
You do.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Indie Spotlight Melbourne, presented by Shani Wise.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jeremy. Really appreciate the conversation. And I'm sorry we didn't get to the meat of it, but that means we maybe can come back for a second opportunity.
I'd be happy to do that, David, if that's something you would like to do. Maybe we should, I'm not sure that there's any other way to do it than this.
Yeah, look, I'd be happy to do it. Maybe let's see. It is difficult to really, because anyway, we've been through it. Thank you. And I think, as I said, the important thing is that we're having the dialogue. I think the minute we stop having dialogue between differing views, that's when we're in the big trouble in terms of our local Jewish community in particular.
Thanks for organising this, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
And
thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, Amir. Bye-bye.
Bye.